In my column in the Australian newspaper this weekend, I'm tackling the issue of updating, in very rough terms, the population projections for 2030 in Australia. We do know that the current population projections that we have that were done in November 2018 can't really be used anymore because the coronavirus really led to big demographic changes already. We have so many temporary visa holders already leaving the country, so we can't use the 2030 population projections anymore. But we really need population projections this time around in order to run businesses successfully. Businesses are right now suffering. They will continue to suffer for a couple of months, but right now is the time for business to position themselves anew strategically. And you do need big picture demographic insights in order to navigate the market. So I tried my best to play with the big picture population variables that we have access to and try to assess what the population of 2030 might look like now in our updated version compared to the original 2030 forecast. And this is scenario modeling, so many different end results can occur. And I'm sharing in this column my favorite one. And I labeled it the missing million. We will miss out by 2030 in Australia about 1 million people of population growth. This population growth that we're missing out on follows a simple logic. We're assuming that we have fixed data. We have really precise population data for 2019. We take this as our baseline. We then look into the population exodus that's occurring. We have many temporary visa holders that are leaving Australia in 2020. You can kind of have a rough guess of what this might look like. We have to estimate that about 500,000 of temporary visa holders will actually leave Australia. International students that are not coming back to study, and just temp jobs that are where there's no point in continuing to be here if this job is cancelled and you don't have access to benefits. So there is a population exodus in 2020. We also do know that if we look the decade ahead, we can see we'll probably not have any migration intake for the next year. There's no way that we open up borders that quickly, that easily, that willingly again. We will then slowly ease into this. We'll likely see, at least in my scenario, we'll see 2 or 3 years of low migration before we kick back into our pre-corona migration intake. Interesting is, of course, also the fertility rate. Every now and then we hear people comment about the corona baby boom. The opposite will occur. We'll not see a population boom or baby boom after the pandemic. These are times of economic uncertainty where people are very shy, if you will, and will not put more babies into the world. In particular, since there are less opportunities to date, to go out there, to form new relationships, to put accidental babies into the world. And of course, we have research numbers from plenty of other pandemics around the world and around history where we know that birth rates actually do plummet. So we can then, for our model, assume falling birth rates, relatively low birth rates for about 2 years, 3 years, and then that kicks back into normal gear. That's all pretty interesting. The death rate, Australia is managing the coronavirus pretty well at the moment. So we don't need to adjust our death rate, I would argue, in order to predict what the 2030 population might be like. And the end result is that we will have, by 2030, we'll have 29 million people living in Australia rather than 30 million people living in Australia. That's somewhat interesting. But the real interesting bit that we are looking at here in this column is to understand who the missing million is. What kind of population are we actually missing out on? And the population that we're missing out on are the young generations, are Millennials, Gen Zs, and Generation Alpha, the very youngest of the generations. These are the guys that we're missing out on. And it makes sense because Australia runs a skilled migration program, and also relies heavily on international students. So the migration growth that we are missing out on are the young generations. The older generations are more severely impacted from a health perspective, from the virus, but since they are not really part of the migration game, the generations will be pretty much not changing all that much or significantly in numbers. If you then look at the changing population growth from 2019 to 2030, our adjusted numbers, we will see that there is actually a couple of years in the life cycle where we see population decline in 2030 relative to 2019. And these are the 22 to 28 year olds. What that means for you if you run a business, if you rely on 20 to 28 year olds as your customers, if this is essentially the product that you're offering is right bang in the middle of this age group, then you will have not a fun decade ahead. And I'd argue that the business that is most positively being impacted in a negative way by this will be universities. Universities not only see the pie of population shrinking, the 22 to 28 year olds, that's essentially the age group of unis. Not only is the pie getting smaller, but the composition of the pie is getting worse as well. Simply because international students stay in their home countries, and so they have to focus more on local students. And in Australia, in our economic and university system, international students are much more financially lucrative than local students. So unis have a really rough decade ahead. And they will then focus their attempts to make up the budget deficit by focusing on executive education, on focusing more on postgraduate degrees, on getting the established workforce back into university for fairly expensive, highly specialized postgrad short courses, I'd imagine. If we then look at generations that are, of course, really severely impacted as Gen Z as well, this is shrinking. Gen Z over the 2020s would have been the generation that contributes the most to migration. They still, in relative terms, contribute quite a lot to the migration intake, but they will take a big hit. That also means, from a broader societal perspective, that the generation that we're not taking in so much, their relative importance in Australia is diminished. That means that there are fewer people out there that can really push the Gen Z values of having a really global mindset. We'll see a bit less of that, for better or worse. We also see that the Millennials, even though they will be impacted to a degree by the missing million, they will be the biggest, most attractive market to conquer, to target for any type of business in Australia over the 2020s. This is simply because even though the older generations, the Gen X, the baby boomers, the pre-boomers, even though they are not negatively impacted in terms of population size, they are people that will increasingly rely on drawing their superannuation as an income. And right now, as super balances for many people are diminished by 20-30%, that means those guys are not going to be great customers. Not so millennials, Gen Y. They are in the family formation stage of the life cycle in the 2020s. They also have nice incomes because they overwhelmingly sit in knowledge work jobs that are pretty stable, actually, to a large degree. They have the borrowing capacity. They can sit out. They're young enough. They can sit out an economic downturn. They can borrow. They will enter the housing market at large scale. They will raise families in the 2020s. If I had to pick one generation to focus my marketing strategies on over the 2020s, it would be the millennials. They are in the nicest age of the life cycle of spending. Remember, they will be in the 42-year-old cohort, some of the millennials. And at no point in your time, in your life, do you spend more money than when you're 42. Because you have a mortgage, you have 1.8 kids at home, and you have a high income, so that means that every penny that you earn goes straight out the door. it's wonderful for the economy, really annoying for you, but that's what will keep the economy going over the 2020s, will be to a large degree the millennials. More numbers around this are, of course, to be found in the Australian this weekend, and I will, of course, be sharing more insights like this over the coming weeks, so feel free to subscribe to this channel.